The first one since the COVID pandemic. And we want to thank you for being a part of this. We miss
That's true.
This face-to-face interaction, and this is a wonderful moment for us. I want to thank Sandy Lynn from the Cowboy County Public Library, and to thank her for her collaboration and partnership in this series that we've done in the last 2 years. I want to introduce our speaker. A lot of you know Dr. Pizzo. A lot of you have taken classes with him, worked with him, and I would say that he needs no introduction, but I believe he deserves one. Dr. David Pizzo is professor of history at Murray State University. He holds a PhD in history with an emphasis upon African and European history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Phi Beta Kappa, I understand, as well. He is our graduate coordinator. He is our study abroad guru. He has taught courses all over Europe and on the African continent, and he really knows his stuff. And I think that you will agree after you've heard his presentation. So, Dr. Pizzo, we invite you to come forward to address the forum.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I forgot this is the first in-person one.
The first one. That's right.
As of September, they're in the new building. Yes, awesome. Okay, there's a lot of ways. Fingers crossed. So that's why we're here and not in the library, obviously. So I'm Dr. Pizzo, just like the food with an O instead of an A. So, and Brian said we need volunteers to do the library program, and I, like a fool, volunteered to go first. And I was in Germany at the time, so I was in Germany last fall, as I often am. And so I was thinking about, well, let's talk about what this place, what Germany is dealing with. And some of this will be very familiar to you. It's not as if the crises I'm going to be talking about aren't facing us, but several of them are much closer to the Germans. I mean, just as an example, I would periodically, if I was feeling too good about how things were going, just Google where the front was. So, which, you know, here when you talk about the Ukraine war, it's sort of an abstract thing that's thousands of miles away. I was able to drive there in a day, and it's like a day's drive. It was about 1,200 miles. Should be a long day, but it's really not that far. It's like if war were raging in Colorado, essentially, to put this in perspective. Or the number of people they've absorbed, I'm about to talk about, I mean, they've taken in, it's over 1.2 million in 2 waves. Whoa. Which, if you adjust it for population, would be like us absorbing almost 9 million. We have not absorbed 9 million refugees, by the way. Like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude less than that, so. Not that it's a contest or a race at the bottom. This is the most screwed in 2023. Germany has a lot of advantages, of course, as well. I mean, it remains the 4th largest economy in the world. Its per capita income is quite high. You know, the brand made in Germany allegedly at least still means something, but let's talk about what they're dealing with. So that's just the abstract. So just a little bit about me. I don't consider myself too much, but just why am I talking about this? Why do I know anything about this? So I myself, when I was a wee tiny baby at 19, like some of the other grads in here, studied abroad in Berlin. That's the first place I went, which we could argue is not very representative of Germany, but it is what it is. And I got hooked, and I went back year after year after year. I've lived, I think I just did the math yesterday, it's almost 6 years now total that I lived in Germany. Much of Berlin, but also Koblenz. I was in Cologne for a while. Gotha in Eastern Germany, so Regensburg over and over, Munich. So I've got that going on. You know, I'm a German speaker. I write works of German history. I also, starting already back in 2008, started doing programs in the German-speaking world. The first one was in Bregenz, Austria, and then I went to Berlin. Here's our students. You probably recognize a bunch of them from 2017. There's Tracy and Laura and Megan. So, you know, this is a place I've been going to for a long time. You know, I don't think, I saw on Twitter the other day, like, do you have to be a Francophile to study France? I don't know, it seems like most of them are. I think Germany, it's a little more fraud, because people look at you weird. Feel like, I'm really into Germany, given the Spanish making, right? Like, well, we're on that in a moment. But nonetheless, I think you could consider me a Germanophile. You know, that being said, you know, it's a complicated society like ours who, you know, I really hesitate to just say it's one thing. I mean, it's over 83 million people. And, you know, if nothing else, you know, it's an interesting place. So where even is it? I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, but again, I assume no base knowledge at all. It's here. There it is. So even that is not as unfraught as it may seem to you, given that map changed over and over and over. In fact, this thing you're looking at is only 31 and a half years old, which I know some of you sounds like a million years ago, but for those of us who, you know, were born in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, it's only 30 years old. In its current configuration. It's right in the middle of Europe. It borders 8 other countries, which maybe is 8 too many, given some of the things that have happened. But yeah, so that's what we're talking about. As I said, it remains, you know, it's the largest country in Europe. German is the largest first spoken language in Europe. It's about 83 million people, as I said. 4th largest economy on the planet. You know, I think many people would argue it's a success story. I mean, certainly given where we were at 45. The bar is so low for them. Yeah, and so one of the reasons I'm talking about this is to give you just a little bit of background and to remind you why I'm employed here. So I am, next spring, I'm going to be on leave, finally, my first one ever, actually. I'm going to be working on a book that synthesizes German history. And now you're like, are there a bunch of those? Yes, there are, but very few of them have really engaged with all this new stuff that's come out about Black Germans, or, you know, diaspora communities, or looking at Germany sort of globally as opposed to just a European thing. This is actually the cover from our a book I put out during the pandemic called After the Imperialist Imagination that talked about Germans in Hawaii and the relationship with Japan. It was just sort of all over the place, all these really interesting connections. So in talking today, I was thinking about, well, what am I going to say in the last chapter? Because synthetic works like that, they go up to the present, and the last chapter is going to have to be, you know, the unending cluster F question mark. I don't know what it's going to be called. You know, the age we're in right now, I don't want to overstate this, but it's just been disaster after disaster, and the Germans have been right in the middle of that in a way that I think even makes our situation look pretty ideal. And, you know, this needs to be said, I think, from the outset, Germany is not a society that has an uncomplicated relationship with its past. It's the understatement of the day. And I think you could say that about almost any country, but I think a lot of other countries, for a variety of reasons, that relationship isn't as fraught because either they haven't been forced to be as reflective, or, I mean, the Germans just, I mean, you know, they got caught so badly with their entire arm in the cookie jar twice, and are surrounded by people that remember them committing the worst possible crimes you could possibly imagine, and Germans have to deal with that. I mean, particularly, I guess, your generation is the one that really was like, no, we have to talk about this. Because for a little while, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, there was sort of this culture of silence. But, you know, Germans born, certainly since 68, are very aware of, you know, this is the monument in Berlin that deals with the Holocaust, though I want to point out even it was only opened in 2002, again, relatively recently. So Germans, just even the idea of being German is so fraught. My daughter right now is in Girl Scouts, and they're doing a thing on Germany, and they like made a bunch of little flags, and I'm staring at it, and like, a German would do this, right? Like, you know, I mean, other than World Cup, which has like a loophole in terms of them being excited. The rest of the time, the Germans really, with some exceptions, and they're usually not the best people, are not super excited about waving the flag or emphasizing their German. I see the Germans nodding. Like, it's embarrassing is overstating it, but it's awkward. And so that makes any discussion of what are we going to do about Russia, or especially that one. Like, what are we, you know, given, more than that in a moment, given some of the things that happened, you know, what does that mean for us now? You know, and this really is, I'm not going to say, I don't think it's a bad thing. My God, I wish most countries were as contrite as German public culture at least pretends to be. But, you know, when you're dealing with Brexit, climate change, refugee crises, war in Ukraine, Germany's awkward sort of sense of itself, and then its relationship with every single one of its neighbors, which is fraught to varying degrees, whether it be Poland or just any of the places around it, you know, it makes it really awkward for them. This became very obvious during the Euro crisis in 2010, when other Europeans said, all right, Germany, let's see it. What are we going to do? You know, the euro is collapsing. You have financial crisis in Spain and Greece and Ireland. And the Germans just spent a lot of time sort of pandering and moaning and really making a show of not really doing anything. So it was this weird spectacle of Europeans begging them to do something, and then just sort of standing there, sort of paralyzed. For, I would say, internal political reasons, and again, because, you know, the Germans' move really after 45 was to lean into being European. I think that's the thing they did. largely in collaboration with France, this sort of pivot to like, we're not German anymore, like we're part of this European thing. But it's this reality that they're very afraid to throw their weight around, but almost nothing can happen without them. I mean, they are such a huge part of the EU's total economy, even more so now that Britain has left. If anything, that's increased to a certain degree German hegemony. But both Germany's other neighbors really dislike the idea of German hegemony intensely. Well, and Germans themselves don't like it either. So I just pointed this out because it could not be more different from a country like the US or Russia or China. They're very comfortable with their own awesome. Like they're, to put it lightly, like there's not a whole lot of, oh no, should we throw our weight around in the world? I mean, to us it just seems obvious, or the Romans for that matter. So, and the German political system is weird, because of course it is, right? It's a sort of Frankenstein's monster constructed of what the British and the Americans and the French kind of wanted, and Germans' own ideas about liberalism. On the one hand, in some ways it's a much more democratic society than I would argue, at least in terms of how its legislature works, than the US or even Britain, because it's proportional. But on the other hand, it's this weird duality of like, it's a party system, like we're voting for parties, but they end up with these chancellors, like 3 of them for 16 years each. That's nuts. I want you to imagine they had 3 different presidents each for 16 years. And I would argue that it was set up that way, going back to Bismarck, not to get thousands of years ago. But it was born essentially as a thing where these really powerful personalities were sort of leading. The other paradox, of course, is Germans don't pick their own head of state or head of government. That's not how it works. You're voting for party lists. Indeed, Germans in their entire history have only voted for their head of state twice, and both times they picked Hindenburg, which is a different talk. Anyway, they didn't always make the best choices. I know it's a little toasty in here. It's all right. It's just the hot air coming out. Anyway, and we just had one of those transitions from Merkel, who, for a lot of Germans, felt like she ruled for thousands of years. I mean, it was in 16 years that she had been chancellor. Now here's Olaf Scholz. And I don't want to overstate this transition being sort of earth-shattering insofar as one of the other paradoxes of Germany is you sort of have 2 parties that not only alternate, but often are ruling together, which is very difficult for us to imagine. If like the Republicans and the Democrats formed a coalition, and then miscellaneous was the position, but that was the situation for over a decade. So, the German political system tends to emphasize, subduing conflict. That's what I'm going to say. And it has a lot of things baked in to try and prevent some sort of splinter horror show, but more on that in a moment, because to some degree that has happened, like a far-right party or whatever. I mean, back in Weimar, if you got 1/10 of 1%, you were in the legislature. Like the Kathy is Amazing party, if it had gotten enough votes, that threshold now is 5%. Like you can't even be in the legislature unless you've cleared that hurdle because they don't want some of the things that happened to the democracy to happen again. So, that's the society that's dealing with what a series of disasters. It's like a layer cake with crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. And these are all, of course, feeding off each other, and I can't cover any of them in a ton of detail. My point actually is that they're all interlocking, and that this is a country that feels awkward about using its power, whose populace has very complicated feelings about their past. I don't think it was fun running Germany in 1990 or in 1890, but my God. And again, some of this will be very familiar to you. We just talk about these sort of refugee crises, as they're usually termed, and there were 2 waves of this in 2015 and 2022. Some of us were there during the one in 2015. Then we have to talk about this complete disaster, which, it would just be funny if it weren't putting millions of people's lives into a precarious situation. And, I mean, if anything, it's probably, I think we could argue it's worse for the UK. But it's not great for the EU either in terms of what it implies about its permanence or, the European Union barely even had a mechanism for anyone to leave. It's like one paragraph on one page. It's like, in the unlikely event someone went, this is maybe how we would do it. That Brexit didn't start the slide. I mean, I would argue in many ways it was the financial crisis in 2008 and the euro coming under so much pressure and the Greek economic implosion. Anyway, they're dealing with all that. Then they're dealing with the global rise of populism and authoritarianism. I don't know, we can argue maybe in the Q&A some of the definition of these words, but both in Germany and in the world in general, I think it's a little difficult to argue that things have not been politically exciting between Brexit in 2015, the Trump victory in 2016, which Germans could not get their minds around. I'll say more about that in a moment. They were just stunned. But surely this isn't a thing that you're going to do. But also, you know, they don't really get to point fingers at anyone given the rise of the AfD, or as we're going to talk about, they had they just shut down a terrorist cell in December. That again would just be funny if their plan hadn't been to seize the Bundestag and execute a bunch of people on TV. And some of you may have heard a little bit. And it just sort of seems sort of comical, because like, who even are these people? Well, they're like members of the armies. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. And then they're dealing, of course, with climate change. That's a picture of the Elba that ran so dry it exposed stones that said, if you see this, cry, because you're about to die. These descriptions, literally from the Middle Ages, from the last time the river had been that low. The Dust Bowl, Bavaria is turning into a Dust Bowl, essentially, in terms of its agriculture. And that interlocks, of course, with energy policy, which then interlocks with this. So we haven't talked about that. I want to talk a little bit about COVID, which, hit them just like it hit the rest of us. And then just this whole, what a disaster. The German relationship with Russia, which was already really complicated and drew a lot of criticism from some of their allies even before 2022, and now they're locked in this awful situation where they are, to a certain degree, dependent on Russia, and still have all these, I'll just call them their fantasies, that they're going to be able to tame Russia by sort of being nice to them, combined with the reality of the fact that, 1,200 miles away, everything is on fire. So, even dealing with one of these would be, I think, a lot, but dealing with all of them at the same time. Oh, so let's talk about this first. And I put that in air quotes because, this is really a matter of perspective. As one German pointed out in 2015, it was a lot of people that showed up. It would be like if you were in a bar with 80 people and one mortar came. So from that perspective, it doesn't seem so bad, but, the numbers were huge. Berlin alone, at one point, it was over, I think, 1,500 a day were arriving. I took students in 2017, since you saw in that picture at the beginning, to a cigarette factory. They converted it to a refugee camp because people were flowing in so quickly in 15, mostly from Syria, but also Afghanistan and Iraq, Somalia. They almost reactivated the law that said the German government could put refugees in your home, which was a law from the late 40s, back when there were huge waves of German speakers being ejected from Central and Eastern Europe. It didn't come to that, but as I said, they're turning cigarette factories into provides refugee centers. So they absorbed over 1 million in 2015. They were the largest recipient of refugees. And now, that had caused all kinds of issues. It had certainly inflamed the rhetoric, particularly on the right, and I would argue, I don't want to argue one-to-one causality, but the rise of the AfD, we're going to talk about in a moment, they were absolutely feeding on stories like, Cologne New Year's in 1516 was like a disaster where people got attacked, and, there's all kinds of discussions about these people assimilate. So, they were still working through that, and it was only 7 years ago when then they were put in a position where they could absorb another 1.2 million and rising. And again, it's all relative. Poland is 3 or 4 million they've absorbed, which, Poland is a country that's significantly smaller in terms of population, but, as I note on here, the equivalent would be, Germany's a country of 83 million. The US, if we adjusted it proportionally, would have to absorb almost 9 million refugees, which is not what we've done. However we feel about that. It's a much smaller number. And part of this is pure geography. The fact that whether it's just crossing the Mediterranean or walking from Ukraine, there are options to get there that are very different than reaching North America. Part of it is that their allies, like the Italians, apparently were just like waving people through. Germany's this way. Well, some stayed in Italy. Most of them wanted to go to where the money was. They wanted to go to Germany, they wanted to go to Sweden, they wanted to go to Britain. This is part of the backstory for Brexit also, all of this. And I would argue that Germany has responded relatively magnanimously. Again, every one of these, almost without exception, is sort of intertwined with how difficult their past is. The laws they have on the books have to do with the 40s, basically. They are either rules they put in place to try and absorb this. It was almost 12 million German speakers that fled Eastern Europe. Places like Pomerania, Silesia, East Prussia was not Kaliningrad. Those populations, there were all kinds of rules about accepting them, and then almost inadvertently, as of the 60s and 70s, that became a policy that made them, relatively speaking, willing to take in refugees from, for example, the Yugoslavian wars in the 90s. A large number ended up in Germany. But this was always something that was debated very ugly, in a very ugly way during the Yugoslavian wars. It was clear Germans weren't really happy those people were there, and most of them were deported when the war ended. So they were sending Bosnians with physics degrees back to Bosnia because their immigration laws are extremely strict, in many ways stricter than ours. Their citizenship laws are also different than ours. You are not a German if you're born in Germany. I mean, to be fair, not even France does that even more, even though it was invented in France. You have the idea of the 14th Amendment, that if you're born in a place, you get citizenship. That's not true in Germany. And they created paths to citizenship, but it involves essentially an assimilationist notion that they have to be German and they have to become like us. So they're working this, but it's caused, I think the biggest fallout has been political. Certainly locally, this shows you where they went. Looking at you, Berlin. They're like swollen based on how many people arrived. Most of them went, not surprisingly, to either the industrial cities over here or Hamburg and Berlin is where they went. And, as I noted, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, doesn't that sound nice? It doesn't an alternative. So the Alternative, more on them in a moment, they politically were really the main beneficiary of this. So they're dealing with that, and somewhat related to that, I love the German view of Brexit. I'll just look at Kathy looking at this. The EU managed to survive the Euro crisis in 2010. I had colleagues at the time who the EU is dead. I don't think the EU is dead. I mean, if you look at, it's like sunken cost theory. The amount the French and the British and the Germans have put into this. So it did manage to survive, but Britain, as you will, this is not the place to tell that story. But the British, in a referendum attended by at least several British people, chose by a small margin to leave. And, on the one hand, there was a part of the German public opinion and official opinion that was sort of good riddance. I mean, the British really were, and I say this with love in my heart, terrible members of the EU in terms of the kinds of exceptions they demanded and the things they would fight against. I mean, they were the ones who pushed on purpose for widening the EU without deepening it to prevent deepening from happening. So, and they had an amazing deal that looks very much like the deal they say they need now. Like, we need to not be in the EU, but have this list of things. Like, that's what you had. So there were some Germans who were like, good riddance to you. If this is how you're going to be, you've made our lives very difficult. Bye. But that being said, I mean, Britain was not only the second largest economy in the EU, it was most of their military capacity, which matters when you're doing things like trying to send stuff to Ukraine. And of course, it didn't bode well for other forms of Euroscepticism that were closer to home. There are plenty of Germans who also question whether they should be in the EU for some of the same reasons, whether it's migration or the Germans feel, not incorrectly, if you look at the math, that they sort of pay a disproportionate amount because of being rich. They pay more than anybody. I mean, the only country that's close is France in terms of the amount of outlays they put into the EU to transfer to poor countries like, Portugal or Greece. And Merkel, I don't know, the EU essentially just kind of stood there watching Britain flop about, trying to figure out what it wanted to do. Because the people who chose this, as far as I can tell, didn't have an actual plan to execute it, apparently. We've now learned disastrously. So I think, the EU, in some ways, I think was ironically strengthened by this. I mean, the fact that the EU survived with them going and managed to respond. One of the things the British were hoping was that there'd be sort of a divided response, but that really isn't what happened. I mean, essentially the French and the Germans got everyone in line and said, yes, we'll continue to deal with them, but we're not going to cut them any slack. They were pretty horrified, though. I mean, as were a lot of people in Britain, to be fair. We'll never know what was the turnout of that referendum. It was not even half, right? No, so it was like barely above half of less than half that chose this. So, you've heard of this, I'm sure. This is a thing that happens. And, I said this over and over, it's all relative. I think they dealt with this certainly better than Brazil or India, or for that matter, the US. 166,000 dead is a lot of dead. But, like, if you control for population, they're only about 660 or 1.2, so we've, doubled their total. Again, not that it's a numbers game, but so they were relatively good at preventing mass death. Their lockdowns were lockdown light. So their lockdowns, any German who's like, and then we were locked down, like, they're lying. Their lockdown was like the Murray lockdown. I mean, like, yeah, you were inside, and if you had a job that could be remote, it was, but you were not getting arrested, like in Britain or Italy or Australia for being 100 meters from your home. Oh no, there were some places that locked down China until recently where lockdown was very real. Germany was, I would argue, about as severe as Kentucky as a whole, and it varied a little bit by state. And they had stricter mask laws, but on the whole, it was sort of a good luck everyone approach. It helped that they have a real healthcare system. So they were in a little bit of a better position. Indeed, they have enough capacity that they were giving ventilators or accepting patients from other European countries. And the German healthcare system is not perfect. It too is underfunded. It's under severe strain. My God, the things it took, like my kid with RSV sitting in the ER for 7, 8, 9 hours. I mean, they are facing some of the same crises that we are, but I would argue their baseline is just much, much better. The amount of money they spent on this, my God. And that was just, I'm sure it's now probably pushing almost 2. That estimate, I think, was last year. Huge sums of money they've thrown at this. They, for example, paid employers not to fire anyone, was their strategy. And, it had a real effect. You could see this in Regensburg, or I was in Bregenz, Austria this summer. I mean, this amount of fresh dug graves in the cemetery, and you really can see most of them from sort of the above 60 age group. I mean, there was just an enormous loss of life. That the waiting list for tombstones in Germany, I think they're running at like 2 years right now. What? Year 2, man. Oh, my father-in-law died a year ago, like this week, and we still don't have a thing. Wow, 1,000,001 go in the ground. And we're like pretending that hasn't happened, but it has. Things like the cemetery industry are overwhelmed. Right, like we don't think about this because we're alive, but anybody who's lost a loved one in the last 3 years knows all about what I'm talking about. So, it had a similar effect on German politics. It wasn't quite as extreme as here, but essentially the political right in Germany, some of the same people I like to talk about in a moment when I talk about the Reichsbürger, essentially decided COVID wasn't real, or the vaccine was full of nanobots, or pick your version of the kind of stuff I could show you on Reddit right now if you want. It's just, QAnon type stuff. They had demonstrations in Berlin, like this woman in the Statue of Liberty outfit, who I feel like I should be giving my taxes to, like that woman out on Wall Street, but she's like, no, don't tread on me. You could really see American discourses about don't tread on me bleeding into the European context. Well, they're all reading the same blogs now. Right, there's really been a convergence because of media in terms of the right in Britain and in France and in Germany, like sort of feeding off each other. This is Bavaria. There's a lot going on in this picture right here, but it's in front of the Reichstag. Pandemic's not real. So, and the AFD didn't openly deny COVID was real, but they definitely absolutely instrumentalized people's resentment of even the half lockdown to argue that, again, they were the sort of the voice of freedom and individual liberty. This picture right here, best friends forever. So then they're also dealing with internationally and domestically. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm sure they're trying to figure out the nuanced way to talk about this, but this sort of new authoritarian thing that's clearly happened. And not just in the West. I really don't want to go really Eurocentric here. We could talk about Bolsonaro. We could talk about Modi. Turkey has gone down this road, so there have been a bunch of places where this has happened. In the case of the Germans, this is really embodied by the AFD, which, especially if you look at the local level, they literally didn't exist, and then suddenly they surged to, in the 17 election, they hit 13%. And again, it's always a matter of perspective. 13% is not so bad. Compared to the Front National, which regularly gets, that's the thing in France, it's like this, 20, 25%. Or for that matter, the Austrian People's Party, that thing, that's even actually been in government. So on one level, this is sort of a fringe phenomenon, but they're the third biggest party up from 0 in 2010. They weren't a thing. So it certainly does not bode well in terms of, I think it indicates a sort of polarization of politics, not unlike here. And the AfD, they took a hit, they went down a little bit, partially, I don't know, I think part of the problem is the few times they have actually gotten in government, they don't actually know how to do anything. Right, this is not uncommon. Like, they get there, and then that happened with the NPD, which was the previous thing like this. Like, got shut down for being a terrorist cell. It also got its government in a few places, and they had no, like, so what are you going to do now that you're in power? And they just sort of shrugged. They didn't really have a plan. Well, it's much easier to be in the opposition than to actually decide anything. It also didn't help that the CDU went right, which is something that the French political right has usually avoided. This whole, like, we'll move over. The CDU has plausible deniability because the Bavarian half of that party is almost as right-wing as the AfD, because Bavaria, the Texas of Germany. So, like, the mainstream white right went right, and they basically stole votes from them. But still, they're the third largest party, and they're not going anywhere. And I wish that were the only issue they're facing, but they're also facing even creepier things. So, you probably heard about this, I assume. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. So just before Christmas, they arrested a bunch of guys. This was a huge raid on like 130 different homes. 5,000 police were involved in this. This was the largest police operation since the Federal Republic destroyed their army faction back in the 70s. So this was sort of a big deal. One of the things that was most amazing is very little had been said about this before. Like, most people in Germany were like, wait, what? They just sort of seemed to come out of nowhere. And so here's Prince Heinrich XIII from Blois. I do love that they had to go to like a third-tier noble family. So the coup was essentially they were going to storm the Bundestag, take them all prisoner, do some public executions in the matter of Bane or whatever, and replace the government with a monarchy, because the Reichsbürger, your face is priceless right now, Marjorie, because the Reichsbürger's assertion is that no German government since November 7th, 1918 is legitimate. Their argument is that essentially everything from Weimar on, but they don't say a lot about that thing in the 30s. But anyway, Weimar and the Federal Republic were not legitimate governments, and so they make their own passports. I was looking at some of these like at home, and they'll like show them to police that pull them over. I'm a Reichsbürger. Like, that's not a thing. And so there have been several of these guys arrested with enormous caches of weapons. But this group, there are a bunch of former and allegedly current, though they have not told us who they are, army officers involved in this. Members of the KSK, that's the Green Berets, who I'd like to point out 5 years ago, several of them got arrested for creating death lists of left-wing politicians, as one does. Who among us is not a simple death list and talks casually about how we're going to eliminate essentially leftist parliamentarians? And they arrested, like, they were current members of the KSK that got arrested, and there were 2 trials. One was like a mistrial, and the other was an acquittal, so very little came of this. I'm just gonna make this like straight eyes and face emoji, like, nothing was done about this, but some of those same people apparently were involved in this. And, you know, we can write this off as sort of like a fringe thing. Like, their chances of success were not there. I mean, obviously they got shut down. But it does tell you there is sort of an undercurrent in Germany now with people that do not accept the legitimacy of the state, do not accept the legitimacy of the lockdowns. That was in the mix. They're incredibly anti-Semitic. They openly said they wanted to model what they were doing on January 6th. They said that very explicitly. Well, again, but it's all, everyone is watching everyone. So this one got shut down. He wears a very nice suit. I'm sure he's very rich. He's got like a huge financial firm that, of course, is based in London, because of course, a massive sum of money somehow came to them. Somehow. The usual suspects, it rhymes with Basha, has said, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That seems like an internal matter, is what they say with their reaction. We would never support a right-wing coup in Germany. And they just stared at them. I don't know what they're supposed to say. And we're in Russia at the moment. But this is the problem, is all their problems are like intertwined with each other. The Russia problem touches on this problem, touches on the COVID problem. So the good news is Germany's turning into a desert. So that's, on a lighter note, the apocalypse has fallen on them. And this is the "you are very screwed and should kill yourself" inscription that got revealed this summer. I mean, literally, the Elbe was empty. I mean, I'm sure you saw those images. Oh my God, the Loire too. The Mississippi was too empty to have boat traffic in it for a while. So this happened, yeah. That happened here as well. We just, I don't know, don't care, question mark? This is farmland in Bavaria, or was farmland. It hasn't rained in some places in literally years now. And Germany's not alone in dealing with this. But, you know, they have a unique burden insofar as, man, they use a lot of energy. I mean, they're not Americans. Their per capita consumption is still about maybe half ours, and that's true of most Europeans, meaning, you know, 20 times the average person of India. But, you know, this is fraught for them because, well, for one thing, I want to say that even if they say the right things, and they say the right things, unlike America from 2017 to 21. So they're saying the right things, but they're not on target to make their Paris goals either. That just needs to be not even close, man. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but one of the things that became clear during Dieselgate is that the German government, certainly in the Merkel years, was like partially like an attachment to the German auto industry. I mean, and I know most of you probably don't remember Dieselgate, where Volkswagen was literally killing people. Twice. Yeah, they got caught, and then it's such a, I mean, I talk about this to the engineering students. Like, it's such a typical way that, like, but basically they got caught polluting far more, releasing more, what is it, nitrogen, I think it's nitrous oxide, is that what it is? Or nitrous dioxide, so it's not fun gas at the dentist, you're asphyxiating in the city. And they think this stuff, I mean, so basically they got caught clean diesel emitting by a California company. It was like, your emissions are 10 times what you're saying. They said, oh my gosh, are you serious? And they ordered the engineers to fix it so no one would notice. So they developed an interrupter switch that noticed when you put a monitor on and gave off different emissions than the real amount. So they like fixed the glitch. Like the engineers are like, okay. And that same firm in California caught them again. They're like, no, you're putting off even more emissions now. And these emissions literally kill people. You know, exports are a massive part of the German economy. They are a larger proportion even than in America. So not a lot of movement there. There has been more movement on the nuclear front. And this was in hindsight maybe not 12 times. But they have shut down basically there's a couple of research reactors still running, but they have in an arc starting in the 2010s to now shut down all their nuclear plants, largely because of the Green Party and upcoming social protests. You know, they've done some of the right things. GDP has gone up, but these have gone down, and some of that has happened in the US as well. But you know, as nuclear shrank, some of it was made up for by renewables, and the Germans brag a lot about how much of that they're doing. It's about 23% of their energy comes from renewables. But the thing that really grew the most quickly, of course, was natural gas. Seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, it's cleaner than coal, which is the other thing they have. I mean, even now, a significant portion of their power comes from not only black coal, but brown coal, which is dirty, dirty coal. Much of it in former East Germany. There's still, like, a lot of the power plants in Germany are still brown coal, lignite plants. So there was a surge of importing gas, almost 2/3 of which was coming from Russia by January of 2022. That's roughly where it was. This is a moment where the Americans were right. You know, I mean, I guess we lecture them all the time, and I think they kind of roll their eyes on the other side of the Atlantic when we tell them things. But like a broken clock, at least twice a day we're right, and on this, well, you really don't want to develop quite that much dependency on one source, given who they are. And as I'll talk about others, like, no, this is going to be fine. Us and the Russians, we got this. We're pros. To give you just a quick comparison, this is with the US. We're at about 13% renewables to their almost double that, and a lot more oil than they use. So before anyone's like, what is America looking like? Not great either. So these are the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, which the Germans invested a lot in, both financially and in terms of political capital. They both roughly follow the same route. Nord Stream 2 has not been turned on because people got all upset. And it was also sabotaged by someone. It's not exactly clear, but you know, this strategy, as we'll talk about in a moment, it made a lot of sense. But it really did not help with climate change much. I mean, it's cleaner than coal, but it doesn't actually fix the problem. And then two, of course, it backs them into this corner where the Russians are in a position to force them to freeze to death. But more on that in a moment. By a moment, I mean now. So, don't they look so happy? He looks so young here, anyway. Young, sprightly Putin. Better days. So, I'm not sure most Americans really are aware of this, but, you know, the Germans, relationship with the Russians is very fraught. And this is a relationship that has all kinds of layers to it. I think some of the discussions about it sort of kind of began with the fall of the Soviet Union as if that's where this story started, but the story is much older than that.
Yes.
Right? Like pick your moment. There's a fairly old notion among both German and Russian elites who go to the same spas in Baden-Baden and read both read Dostoevsky. Like those two elites, I would argue for centuries, have had this notion that between the two of them they could control Europe. Well, they're almost right. And there's been all these moments, whether it was the defeat of Napoleon together, or putting down the 1848 revolution, or in the 20th century, the number of times Germany, when no one was paying attention, sort of snuck over this way. I mean, that happened. This is the Rapallo Treaty back in 1922, when Weimar, who was like a pariah, and the Soviet Union, who was a pariah, sort of meet quietly in a room, and suddenly they're like secretly developing tanks in the Urals together. Or this awkward moment. So this is Stalin and the Nazi foreign minister Ribbentrop. So there's like that deal that believe me, Russia would rather you forget about that 2 years where they're on the same side. Or here we are having an amazing barbecue on a stump. So this is Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, and his wife in the lead up to German unification. We have pictures of that also of Kohl with Yeltsin. One of my favorite things in the Bonn German History Museum is object-based. They have Helmut Kohl's coats he wore to these barbecues, and they get larger and larger. You see him growing at a geometric rate. This is a guy who used to have eating contests with Bill Clinton when he came. Anyway, so Helmut, who also was chancellor for 16 years. So, this is a recurring, I don't want to say temptation, theme, that's what I'm going to say. Theme where the Germans and the Russians sort of make deals that involve, I don't know, Poland vanishing or whatever it is they're doing. And at the end of the Cold War, the Germans and the Soviets, then Russians, got even closer. I mean, the Germans essentially cut enormous checks. That was the price for unification for the Red Army leaving. It was billions of dollars essentially in financial transfers. The Germans were some of the first people to show up and invest a ton in Russia. And vice versa, the Russian community in Germany swelled massively. The neighborhood I lived in, both in the 20s and again in the 2000s, had so many Russians, people called it Charlottengrad instead of Charlottenburg. So that, that relationship had been restarted. This had really come a long way, particularly under Schroeder, who just happened to, after retiring, become a lobbyist for Russian energy companies. I'm sure it's a coincidence. Anyway. So that, and the German argument was, not unlike the argument sometimes with China, was that, well, this will civilize them, right? If we trade with them and we make them interdependent with us, it will prevent any sort of shenanigans like them invading Ukraine and turning the eastern half of it into a republic. People said similar things in 1913, right? European economies are too interlinked to ever go to war with each other. That's not really how it played out, but. So suddenly, that relationship already came under fire, particularly of the Poles or the British were always very mistrusting of this. But it seemed okay, and then the war in Ukraine happened. There had been a moment, actually, to be fair to the Germans, during the Second Chechen War, they had complained, and Putin had shut the gas off, and several hundred of them froze to death in the winter of 2006. So that probably should have been a wake-up call. Who's like, oh, is that really how you feel right now? So they had been put on notice already 15 years ago that there were going to be consequences, potentially, if Russia made a choice they didn't like. But once this happened, all of Europe, suddenly this came under a very harsh spotlight. It didn't help that Scholz, poor Scholz, like he'd been in office just a few months, and suddenly he has to deal with this. And he didn't really have an answer. He said the right things. He's made all these cool speeches that one day will be probably a box at an AP exam. About the new course we had, but it's awkward. And discussions about how many, how they should respond to this. Oh my God, what a disaster. It's not just the refugees, but just the money, and you can see the U.S. has given about as much as everyone else combined. The Germans have been fairly reluctant to pump money into this. Free the leopards! This is this campaign to have them give tanks to the Ukrainians. So the Germans on the one hand are basically the fourth largest people to give aid. But given the size of the German economy, this really isn't very much. And again, they're in this position where the left in their country is militantly opposed to war, and has been, I would say, since 45. You have elites who are totally intertwined with the Russians by marriage, by money, and various other things. It's not a great look. And so I think German prestige has really been damaged by this. A lot of the rest of Europe, particularly, the Poles or the Czechs or whatever, are really waiting for some leadership on this. And it's not really been there. I mean, you could argue France, same, but France didn't build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I mean, essentially, the Germans are literally paying for the war in Ukraine, while simultaneously handing the Ukrainian weapons, which to me sums up the disaster. And they've eased off. They've gone from 55% of their gas coming from Russia to, I think it's down to like 23, but that's still billions of dollars they're just pumping into, I don't know. I mean, they've almost figured it out. Free the leopards, here he is. From one of them. I went a tiny bit longer than I wanted to. I wanted to be done at 45, it's like 48. So I'm going to toss it to you because I know I just gave you like a fire hose of all of it. Imagine like living through it. So what questions do you have for me? There's a lot we could talk about.
Any questions? Don't be bashful.
Never just cries. I mean, there's some good news. I tried to intersperse some of that, but I mean, ultimately they're dealing with not a great situation. I think it was maybe Veronica and then Terry. Terry, and then way back to Anthony. He's like so far away.
About Olaf Scholz.
Yes. He's such a typical, he would never be a politician in the US, right? In terms of being sort of a bureaucrat, kind of homely, no one votes for him, party lists. So he strikes me as a very typical German sort of civil servant, civically minded SPD guy. He's very much part of the establishment. One of the problems was precisely that what differentiated the SPD and the CDU, no one's entirely sure. I mean, there's some, at the edges, it's very clear, but in the center, I mean, he and Merkel's policies are almost the same. So, I mean, he's had some bold ideas, he's talked about, like, the €9 ticket. So there's been some sort of populist things he's done, like when everyone can travel anywhere they want for €9, which causes complete chaos. So because they didn't have any train capacity, it just suddenly travel in Germany was free, basically. It's hard to know because, again, they're like weirdly immune as individuals, right? It's like a party situation, and unless, it's all about coalitions. The only reason he's in charge is the CDU's coalition partners managing them, essentially, and moved over. I mostly feel bad for him. He's mostly, I think, that's sort of like, he comes off like a university professor when he gives speeches, which I think is fine, but, as somebody who's used to, whatever, did she say Trump? Boris? I don't know, whatever it is, some theatric guy, he's not that, that's not who he is, but neither was Merkel. Right. So, she was a literal university with a PhD in chemistry, who she knew what Russia was. My God, like she hated Putin. All those moments with his dogs trying to intimidate her, and yet the policy was the same. This is why I don't think it's just about people. I mean, she, having grown up in East Germany, was not a fan, but as Nord Stream continues, the elite pacting to figure out the future of Eastern Europe continued. I mean, essentially, Russia and Germany decided that Ukraine didn't matter long before this war started. They would never admit it. And one of the ironies of the current situation is Russia has so spectacularly stepped in it. This earlier period where the Germans were selling them out repeatedly has now become invisible. Can you believe Russia did this? Yes, I can, French. Remember all those years you were essentially conspiring with them to run Europe together? Now this is what it looks like. He's barely got to even do anything. I mean, he got in office in November 21, and the war broke out in February. So, I doubt he's going to be there 16 years. That's one thing I'm going to say. I don't think that's going to happen this time. No Schultz. I'm just looking. Again, compared to the Kennedy Nixon debates, like, it's not how the politics work. I feel like it's right cut.
Yeah, thank you for showing all these conundrums that exist, all these challenges, and how complex they are. And you didn't take many stands.
I didn't.
Now, I'm going to ask you though,
Sure.
how would you answer if I asked you, and I do.
Sure.
So would you now, if you were in Olaf Scholz?
Oh, the shitty job.
But
Okay, yes,
if
I'm
you
on the German
had to
government.
make the decision,
About?
would you send weapons under the circumstances as you know them? Would you say, yes, we do need to send weapons to Ukraine? That's the question
Sure.
for me.
It's awkward now because now they just seem like Johnny-come-latelys. Right? Like, now it's sort of too little too late because they waited so long, they made everyone so mad. Now they are sending them, but they've already sort of essentially squandered all of their goodwill. So now they might as well, question mark, it's really awful. I mean, ultimately, if they want their relationship with their neighbors in the United States to stay on even keel, they kind of don't have a choice. And they hate it. They're not happy about it. I mean, they...
Mm-hmm. Right, that's why they
I
have
know,
it.
I'm aware. No, I mean, I remember, I, like you, am old enough to remember when the first time Germans ever shot at anyone since World War II was during that rescue operation in Albania in '98, I guess, during like the lead up to Kosovo, and Germans freaked out. They're like, oh my God, we shot at somebody! Which, you know, we Americans don't lose sleep over things like that. We're like, so, you know, if I were in their position, I have to admit I probably do what they're doing, like half-ass it. That's what they've been doing. They're like giving enough to make it look like they're doing a thing and they're saying the right things, but then they're writing a check. And I'm sure there are still conversations happening in private that would be unfortunate if you were President Zelensky in person.
Can I do a follow-up on that?
Please.
My fear about this, or my wondering is that how it happened before, maybe in World War II, that, well, the Germans took this, and then they went in Austria, and then they did this, and nobody said anything, but then eventually something happens and it ignited and it became really large and
That's still gonna happen.
containable.
That's
And
still gonna
isn't,
happen.
do you see, would that increase that chance?
I think ultimately
Or does it not make a difference?
the place where that is going to happen is not some leopard fighting on the plains of Transnistria. It's going to be the border of Latvia and Poland. I mean, that's the issue. I mean, their actual immediate neighbors in Europe, in NATO, are far more fearful of them.
Mhm.
I was like, when we were there and that missile went off in Poland, which was never even clarified. I think it was actually Ukrainian, as it turns out, but I mean, people were flipping out. Yes, it could escalate. But I think the Germans would say ultimately that's on the Russians. Well, they're right on a certain level, the Russians could leave at any time. I mean, they're not going to, because you break you by. And the other thing worse than what they've done so far is if they did this so far and then bailed, in terms of his legitimacy. But yeah, no, of course there's a risk of escalation, but is an additional 4 tanks going to do it? Probably not. But I know why they don't want to. And then, well, see, this is the other thing that came out with the Free the Leopards campaign, is a bunch of other countries who all also have leopards, which doesn't something about German industry. Like, we're told they couldn't because no one won't let you use the parts. Like, the Germans were stopping other Europeans from giving them, which drew into really unfortunate relief how hegemonic German, like, defense production is within the EU. It's them and the French, essentially. So that wasn't a good look either. No, it's definitely lose-lose. I probably would do what they're doing. Enough to not make everyone furious, but not enough to ruin, you know, the ghost of Dostoevsky going with you to the spa in Baden-Baden. Catherine the Great. I mean, this is such an old thing between them that's really difficult for Americans to imagine because we pretend our neighbors don't exist. But even is a thing. So, Anthony, you're so far, but you're right there. What is it?
My question is exactly on that topic.
How many leopards would you say?
Essentially, like, I've heard 2 things. One is pretty new, but the other one I was going to ask you. The first one is, I've heard that Germany is probably very hesitant to send those. I mean, they've already sent those, but like, it's because PR reasons with Russia, because you see
Yes.
German tanks go up against
Yes.
Russian tanks, and the last time that happened, it's pretty awful.
They killed 27 million of them.
Yeah.
There's a weird combination of both some guilt about that having happened, but then fantasies about ruling Europe together. But that's happened over and over. It's like this weird combination of them choking one another and stabbing one another, but then handing each other cash. Like, what is happening? I mean, it's this. No, they don't want the peace. I mean, I repeat, they are literally paying for the war. On the other side. I guess on both sides, but classic Iran-Iraq war. I don't know, I just like, hey, I don't know, it makes me want to die. Because that relationship needs to work. Because you're right, the last time the two of them tangled, the population of Murray died every day for 4 straight years. That's how bloody that was. It was 18,000 a day.
Yeah.
Say again?
Putin is already yelling that
I
German
know.
tanks are threatening them.
I know. It's not a good look. It's a great look for Putin.
That's
Like, you see
very
this
good.
man? These things with the Iron Cross. I mean, they even have the Iron Cross on them. I mean, it's just, it writes itself.
Yeah.
If you've not watched Russian commercials about this, you should. All those commercials about all Europeans freezing to death and then going to Russia to get a boyfriend to save themselves. So yes, it's not a great look for them, but it's lose-lose. Hence Dr. Aver's question, like they can't not do anything unless they're willing to relinquish their lead role in NATO and the EU, but they don't want to do anything, and so they're doing something. It would just be an academic question, but Ukrainians are dying in their thousands, so, and 1.2 million of them have washed up in Germany, so, yes.
One question.
Yeah.
One item you didn't mention was the fact that when Germany was split, things happened for a series of years.
Which time? You
Well,
mean
this is
the
the Berlin Wall
49 to,
period,
yeah,
etc.
sure.
And then the Berlin Wall came down.
Yes.
But it doesn't appear that that was a major issue, Germany coming back together as one country.
I think that's in hindsight, I don't think that's how it felt at the time. It's certainly not how it played. I see the British historian and the French, like, that's not how it played in Paris and London. They were actually really freaked out. The reason it happened was essentially the Soviets came around for cash, and because of, I wasn't in the room when they had these conversations, but I'm sure there was some talk about destiny. And then Bush won. The country that most pushed to, like, hey guys, it's gonna be fine, it was the US. Because Thatcher was absolutely adamant that it should not happen, and their immediate neighbors were not happy either, but what were they going to say? So in hindsight, it happened smoothly. It was certainly a much smoother transition than 1871 or, my God, 1918, 19. And I think it is a testament to the fact that, decades embedded in what became the EU and embedded in NATO had civilized the Germans. I mean, the way the architect of NATO in Britain had phrased it as the point of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Americans in, and the Russians out. And so it seemed to have done that, but there were a lot of people who were quite upset at the time. It really messed up the balance, right? West Germany, France, Britain, and Italy were roughly the same size in terms of population and economy, and all of a sudden Germany got much bigger. There was really worries they were going to be a juggernaut. The good news is that East Germany became, and I say this with love, a $2 trillion sinkhole in terms of what they've actually put in it. So if anything, I think, at least in the short term, it reduced their competitiveness, but I don't know. My retort to the West Germans always, of course, is that East Germans were left entirely holding the bag for reparations to the Soviets, who were coming out of East Germany until the very end, basically until the Red Army left in 1994, and West Germany didn't have to deal with it. So that, yeah, in hindsight, that seems like it was pretty smooth. But that could have gone very differently if, one, the U.S. hadn't pushed so hard, or more problematically, if the Red Army had reduced to 80. Right? I mean, that situation, 2 plus 4, none of that would have happened had the Soviets not, for their own reasons, wanted billions of dollars, essentially, and, Gorbachev he was dealing with a few things in 1990 internally. That's a polite way to put it. Yeah, the Berlin Republic has been fairly well behaved and has certainly been more smooth than the integration of Imperial Germany in the 1880s, 70s, but that's a low bar. And, of course, East Germans would tell you they were essentially annexed. I mean, they were 17 million to about 65. I mean, we think of it as like half-half. It really wasn't. I mean, it's a much smaller piece. And so even constitutionally, what happened is the Federal Republic essentially just backmanned East Germany. And they wouldn't say that in Berlin. They're like, no, it was blah, 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 we give them this money. But, I mean, they basically just gobbled it up. And then spent $2 trillion on it, which is so much money, but, I haven't lived in Eastern Germany. It's cool, but there's some structural issues that they're working on. they're the lucky ones. There was no West Czechia or West Romania to suddenly show up and spend trillions of dollars on them, and the rest of them are going to do it on their own. So, other questions? Other flashpoints? Yes, Matthew.
On the topic of unified Germany, is there a large social difference in the way that people, particularly your age group, view Russia?
Sure. In East and West?
Yes.
It's layered. I think the differences over time have become somewhat more muted, if only because of the passage of time. And you have to understand, like 89 doesn't seem that long ago to me, and some people in this room, but for other people in this room, what even is a 1989? Like I get it. Your age group was born well after all this happened, and so there's been sort of a convergence. I think it sort of depends if you're if you're in a place like Leipzig versus if you're in like rural East Germany. But I can say the same thing about Kentucky, right? Because I think places like Dresden and Leipzig have sort of, all this money is got in, there's jobs there, Berlin is where all the cool stuff is now, but if you're in like rural Turingen, it's not great. So there are some differences, but I think in terms of how they feel about Russia, I think it depends on the age group, because I think the older generation in East Germany are not fans. Like if they remember, so many of them I talk to, like, I had to learn Russian, and now I don't remember a word. Like, I forgot it all. It was an awkward thing. I think it gets very interesting when you look at younger East Germans. I think their attitudes and younger West Germans are pretty similar. They just really hate war in much larger numbers than Americans. I mean, you can't even get a majority of Germans that would take up arms to defend their country, at least according to polling. Japan's same. Nothing sobers you up like every city, like all of your cities being completely destroyed. So I think there's a generational cleavage in that older East Germans are really not fans of Russia and felt like they were an occupier, and younger ones divide much more like Americans do. Either Ukraine am a profile, or I've read too much on 4chan, and I think Putin is liberating us from wokeness. I mean, they've got those same sorts of divisions in Germany. I read Reddit, and it told me that Putin is a savior. Oh, that's what he's selling, right? Like, that message plays on the right in Germany just as well. The idea that I'm saving the world from, transsexuality and wokeness and all these other things he says he's doing. Anyway. I mean, from your own grad program, there's a diverse set of perspectives on this issue. Ranging from, we gotta help Ukraine, to I'm converting to Russian Orthodox. True story, right? So, I see some of you just like closing your eyes, dreaming of somewhere that less closely resembles hell. But anyway, yes, it is that younger age group. It really depends on what they've stumbled into on TikTok, largely. Well, that's with reality now. So.
I mean, I didn't know. I mean, didn't spend a lot of time.
Older East Germans, because I talked to a lot of older Berliners, fuck them. I mean, the best thing that ever happened is those people left. I mean, they were not fans.
Same place, different dictatorship. They just.
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier for them to talk about how much they don't like the Russians than for them to talk about their own complicity in the second dictatorship. Because that's the other thing, of course, the Germans had not one but two dictatorships in a row. Two great hates that hate great together. I mean, maybe this dictatorship will convince you. That one lasts even longer, but, German, you saw those demonstrations in Berlin. There were these huge demonstrations opposing the war, and then, on the other side, like Ukrainian flags were flying everywhere. There's all kinds of symbolic politics that have developed. I don't think most people really quite understand the stakes are. They do know that they were in danger of freezing to death. I mean, at the beginning of this winter, you were there with me. They're like, we're not really sure if we're going to have any heat in buildings. Like, there was talk about shutting down every public building. The only reason they didn't is climate change meant that it was still in the 70s well into November. So one disaster in this case helped them with another. So this is a moment where, no, it was like this area in November. It's just how much warmer it's gotten. So that was, yay, we're not going to freeze to death, but oh god, the Elba's empty. So, Terry, and then
Schultz and Macron have a very frosty relationship.
compared to Merkel and Macron, yes.
One of the worst that's been
I agree with
in
that.
a long time, and had that relationship been different, I think the outcome of what's happening now.
Right. But nearly every single time that relationship has been the way it was the German right. Right? It was Adenauer, it tended to be the German right who embraced them, whereas the SPD, whether it was Brandt, or again now, tends to look more east. This is like a sort of old dilemma in German policy debates. The Republicans looking east now means they're looking into the maw of the war. But, I think Schultz intended to de-emphasize a little bit that relationship in favor of, all these new plays. So they've seesawed back and forth more than once, and the really close ones of rapprochement tended to be when the CDU was in charge. And I don't know what is going on there entirely, but, Macron has his own problems, as you know, in terms of this country being almost ungovernable, but, yeah, it's both French and German politics are so determined by personality in a way that I think is a little insensitive in both cases, but, I mean, their baseline, it's all relative because a low point of Franco-German relations in the frame we're talking about would be the best relationship they had ever had in the 19th century. So, I mean, given the default was, I've stolen your quadriga, you're surrendering a rail car, I'm gonna need you to surrender in that. I mean, it was just like a game of Pong where they were just punching each other over and over. So I think it is a low for recent years, but that just means you said frosty, not, sedan day, or, the things that were done. Now that's something I have to say, is like, we're saying you with the EU, but, it's been World War I free since 1945, so they've managed, mission accomplished. Well, initially, that's what they said it was gonna do, and that was a French and German thing. So, yeah, I thought they were going to get much closer after Brexit, but Schultz really wasn't that interested in it. And, I don't know.
They're a big help for the Eastern Europeans, especially Poland. They're sticking their neck out.
Of course, so is Hungary, who's like the crappiest member of the EU, but on this side. We don't have to talk about Hungary. That's a different talk.
Yeah.
But oh god. Yeah, the Germans have stuck their neck out just enough to try and not alienate people. They're trying to sort of middle course, which seems very German. Just kind of muddling through. Durchwischen, we're gonna sausage through. That's the word in German. Of course that's it. We're gonna sausage through it. It's all about pigs and sausages. Other questions about the festering disaster they're trying to wade through. I mean, many countries dream of their problems. This is not what Central African Republic is facing, or for that matter, Latvia. But yeah, this isn't abstract, it's right there. So. It's so, I don't know, it reminds me a little bit of Dukakis riding in the tank. Like watching him try and, he's such a Beamta kind of, official, he's like a schoolmaster. He's like sitting there trying to puff and talk about, how manly they're going to be. Meanwhile, Putin is like shirtless, choking a bear or whatever. It's just, I don't know. But Germans don't really do nationalism, allegedly. So they say. Except during football and when they're mad about immigrants. Which something you can talk